And thanks very much, Masa, Joyashree, and Glen, our speakers, for those presentations. If you'd like to rejoin us on the screen now, and then we'll begin our Q&A session. We have about 25 minutes remaining of the webinar. So to our participant attendees, now's the chance to put questions to our speakers here who join us live. You can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And don't be shy, no questions too stupid or too complicated. We have some of the best minds in the world here, so let's make use of them. And if some of this stuff was over your head, then of course you can go back to the IPCC reports themselves, which are going to be a fabulous evidence base for years to come on these topics. But also you can visit C2G2's website, where we've provided some briefings and summaries and infographics that help understand some of the issues that have been raised by our speakers here a little further. And that's at 3wc2g2.net. So whilst our participants, our audience are thinking of some interesting questions to put to our speakers, perhaps I might take this opportunity to jump in and pose a question to perhaps each of you in turn. So Glen, in your presentation, you mentioned something that I think also was echoed by Joyashree, which was that carbon dioxide removal only has a function if you're doing mitigation as well. Now, this might be a very basic concept, but could you just say a bit more about why that is? Because for some of our audience here, it may not be self-evident. Why is it? It's not either or. It only makes sense if you're doing mitigation as much as possible as well. Is that the case, or can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so we can take it to, let's say, the first order. You know, the big picture, main effects. And the challenge is that it's a scale question. So we currently emit 40 billion tonnes of CO2 per year. If we magically developed a technology which sucked 40 billion tonnes per year out of the atmosphere and buried it somewhere, you know, shot it out to space or something, so it disappeared completely, then we could, you know, hypothetically probably keep emitting what we're doing and keep and just remove that carbon. But there's no way amongst all the technologies that we know that we could remotely remove the amount of emissions that we emit in a given year. And so emissions have to drop drastically. Let's say if you get emissions down from 40 billion tonnes today to about 5 billion tonnes, then maybe we could remove 5 billion tonnes per year across a suite of technologies. But that's still, I would say, at the high end. You know, if you get emissions from 40 billion tonnes down to 1 billion tonnes, and you only have to remove 1 billion tonnes, then that's still a big number, but much easier to do. So the more you get emissions down, the much easier it is to use removals. And if you think that removals, we can't remove more than 5 billion tonnes a year, and we keep emitting 40 billion tonnes a year, then you can do 40 minus 5, 35 billion tonnes a year. That would be our emissions with removals without emission reductions. So it's sort of the maths which shows you that you have to reduce emissions radically. And on top of that, some removals might help.
Got it. Thank you. Joyashree, I don't know if you want to add to that. Otherwise, I might just have a quick follow-up for Glen on this.
I can just add one example to say why we need to consider this. Say, for example, we usually say in case of air pollution, if it is really difficult, and the cost of reduction is also enormously high, and you cannot actually reduce all of it. So very little pollution can be cleaned up. Even in water pollution also can be cleaned up, maybe with known technology and with manageable cost. So similar is the question here. The more you emit, it becomes harder and harder to remove. In working group 1, actually, they have really shown that how it becomes harder and harder if you have more and more accumulated emission.
Okay, thank you, Joyashree. So we've had the first few questions coming in, so I'll hold my follow-up question for Glen, and we'll go straight to first question from Marie-Valentine Florin, who says, with which CDR options do you see the major sustainability challenges that you briefly mentioned? For example, do you think that DAX could incur large risks? I don't know, Joyashree, did you want to pick this one up? Otherwise,
Okay, so basically, it is important, that if you look into, I would really urge you all to look into the table 12.6, very, very specific table in the IPCC larger report, where I really find very interestingly, it says, it lists all the different methods for CDR, and what are the risks and impacts, and what are its co-benefits, its costs, where the technology advancement is. So it really gives a wholesome picture. So if I think of that, then I would say that basically, if you look at that, you will see that first thing is that not all technologies are developed up to a particular level where it can be deployed. So that is another major issue, right? So it's not that we cannot think of ocean fertilization immediately because that technology hasn't developed up to that level itself. And so if you look into the risk, every option has its risk, but some risks can be managed, and some of the risks which are really hard to manage. So even if you take afforestation and reforestation, you can imagine a forest fire and think of the risk of that. So so how you are looking at these risks, and so every technology has its challenges. And so it has to be really looked into carefully, that how we really look into that, the cost aspect, and also risks to society and to, permanency of the storage also, because it's really important how permanently you can store the carbon that you remove from the atmosphere. Otherwise, leakage will take out what you have removed.
Thank you for that.
Can I just add something
Glen,
on there, just quickly directly on the direct air capture, because direct air capture is often seen as the savior of all these risks, because it can avoid potentially some of the risks. So the advantage of direct air capture is the facility itself has a very small footprint compared to, for example, afforestation or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and so on. So it doesn't take up much land, but direct air capture requires an exceeding amount of energy. And so you do have a land footprint associated with that energy. And also, if we're, getting close to 100% renewables, there might be, some fierce competition over that last bit of energy as well. So it's not necessarily free. And the other thing is we don't know that we can get the costs down. So at the moment, direct air capture is exceedingly expensive. Maybe we can get the cost down to an acceptable level, or maybe we can't. So there's also that uncertainty that maybe we just can't get this technology, because carbon dioxide is, 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. That's not very concentrated. And so to, pluck out so many small atoms of the atmosphere is not easy. And, so we don't necessarily have we'll be able to get that technology down to a sufficiently cheap level. So very important that direct air capture, whilst it deals with some risks, certainly doesn't deal with all risks.
Thanks for that addition, Glen. And that pivots us quite nicely to our next question. So we've heard about some of the challenges that you raised, Joyashree, around permanence, and also that Glen's just raised with regards to some of the sustainability challenges, and feasibility is another issue you mentioned as well, Joyashree. But what about the cost? All this costs, doesn't it? Who's going to pay for it? How's it going to be paid for? Now, perhaps this is more of a policy question, but are there any insights that have come out of the report or that you're aware of in how this might be paid for?
Well,
after you, Joyashree. After you.
Go ahead.
No, so what I wanted to say is that you need to address this cost at par with how you deal the cost of mitigation also, right? So because anyway, you have to look at it from that point of view, although it has to be associated with a specific need for hard to abate emissions and how when you apply these CDR. So if you look at that hard to abate emission part, say for example in industries or in say non-CO2 emission which are remaining and which could not be reduced at the net zero timing and given the net zero timing and goal. So in that case, it may be cheaper, but who pays for this cost? That would always be a bigger question. How do you meet this whole mitigation cost question, right? So, I mean, I don't think it has been answered in IPCC report because that's going to be more a political question because this can be seen as a political question that who bears the cost burden of mitigation, how you relate it to the historical emission, or do you put the burden on those who has not emitted it? So how do you see this mitigation, cumulative mitigation today, and when do you really remove the carbon? So I think this cost burden, who shares the burden, that's a more is a more different question. And I don't think IPCC answers that because it is more about discussing that how much it costs, what are the benefits, and that's the question.
Good, all clear. Either of you like to add to that, Glen or Masa?
Yeah, I can sort of add in a little bit on the equity dimension too. You know, I was talking about the scale. The scale can be immense of this technology, and in some scenarios, about 10 to 20% of global GDP would be spent on technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So it's not a marginal number. But just to put that in perspective, like today, I think you can even go to some companies and you can pay, I don't know, $500, $1,000 or whatever, and, you know, forgive your sins for all you've emitted in the past 12 months or something. And that might sound relatively cheap, right? So I can go continue my life and just pay, you know, $1,000 a year and the problem's fixed. So there's a few issues there. You know, not everyone has $1,000 a year to pay. So there's a huge equity issue. And this is not reducing emissions either. So this is continuing on your lifestyle and offsetting your emissions. So whilst that might help you when we've got carbon dioxide removal at a very small scale, if you want everyone in the world to be able to do that, so then you need to have this 40 billion tons carbon dioxide removal, which just doesn't work. And so there's a big equity issue here if you also go to scale and think about who's paying it. And so does the rich world get the first take of the first carbon dioxide removal? You know, the first of the 5 billion tons, does that go to the rich world, or does that go to, let's say, hard to mitigate sectors, getting the hard work done, offsetting fertilizer production for our food production, and so on and so forth? So there's a really important prioritization. And just to add one very important thing which Joyashree went into is that mitigation, you know, deploying renewables to replace coal, for example, is much, much, much cheaper than these technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's also very important to remember.
Okay, thanks for that, Glen, as well. Now Masa, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add one point about the financial aspect, the cost aspect, because of the scale of the CDR expected in scenarios is very large. So if you implement just as suggested in models, you're going to do a lot of financial transfers across regions. Some countries do a lot more CDR for other parts of the world, and because of the sheer size, expected in models, if you multiply that with the carbon price, that's gonna skyrocket, and that whether we can design such a financial scheme is a very big question. So I think there's a huge governance issue. It's a pure money, but it's a huge challenge. We don't have that right now.
That's a very interesting point, Masa. Thanks for that addition. I think just the scale that's talked about here, that's coming across from the report, that might be needed in future is frankly mind-boggling. And as you've said, Joyashree, as the scale increases, so do the risks, and some of these around feasibility and around the impacts, conflict over land use, I think you mentioned, for example. Just to pivot now to our other topic here that we're covering on solar radiation modification, Masa, we have a question here from Klaus Radunsky, who says, does the risks that come from SRM change given the magnitude of cooling to be achieved? I think that's the question. So if we're trying to do more cooling with this theoretic technology, do the risks increase sort of at the same rate, or what does the report tell us about this?
Yes, and risk does depend on both effectiveness of cooling and the risk from SRM depends on the magnitude of SRM, of course, and that's kind of similar to CDR. So planting trees doesn't cause much problem, and releasing a small a tiny bit of aerosol particles in the atmosphere, it doesn't contribute to much cooling, or it doesn't create much risks either. So I think the best example would be termination effect. So if you deploy SRM on a large scale, and if you stop it suddenly, you're gonna unmask greenhouse warming, and you're gonna have a lot of very rapid warming over the entire climate system. But that magnitude depends on the amount of cooling. So if you have let's say 2 degrees of cooling, then if you stop it, the SRM, then you have a sudden warming of 2 degrees, which is unbearable, I guess. But if you use it to just shave off the exceedance, like overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees by 0.1 degrees, even in the worst case scenario, the risk of termination is proportional to 0.1 degrees of cooling. So that's, I think this is just one example, and many of the risks are, I believe, they increase non-linearly. So if you use the SRM on a smaller scale, the risks can be contained. So I think this is just another way of saying that SRM cannot be the main option.
Thank you, Masa. I'm going to follow on now with another question from Marie-Valentine Florin, who asks about, well, perhaps some context here. I think in the report says, and I think, Masa, you've said this, there are many uncertainties and knowledge gaps around the risks that are faced from this theoretical technology or approach of SRM. And what would be your recommendations or recommendations that have come through in the report about next steps for reducing those knowledge gaps? What next needs to be learned in order to help understand this approach better? Keeping in mind, I think Marie-Valentine mentions that policymakers are not keen on investing in research or looking for governance arrangements. So in that context, what do you think might be next concrete steps for reducing those knowledge gaps?
Thank you for this excellent question. I think I need to take off my IPCC hat, because the IPCC is policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. But whether we should do research on SRM itself, this is a highly controversial topic, and there are some scholars fiercely arguing against any research on, maybe not any research, but research on SRM, and there are some scholars arguing for such research, and it's a very huge controversy. But one thing we can get, we can learn from the report itself is that debate so far has been concentrated in global north, so developed countries. So that's true for the public perceptions research, and that's also true. We can get this lesson from ethical analysis. So there's a concern about the power relationship between global north and the global south but we should, I think, engage Global South better to really understand, this is my opinion, but we need to have a global conversation about this, whether we should do research or not. And right now, a lot of things have been written in English, but very few reports came out on the, in the United Nations, for instance. And so the IPCC report will be translated into official 6 United Nations languages, but there are very little information about SRM in like non-English settings. So I think we need to talk more about this more openly.
Very good, thanks, Masa. And just a plug for some of C2G's resources, which are impartial. They're available in different languages as well, and we have briefings on this report and the other report and this SRM components there. But this is a very interesting point, and I recall reading in the report, I think in the cross-working group box on SRM, that SRM research is dominated by the global north. And that probably has implications for governance, I would imagine, as I think Maria Valentina's question was getting to. So what implications does this have for research on these emerging technologies being dominated by global north and researchers? And I don't know, perhaps also this is a question for Joyashree and Glen as well with regards to CDR, perhaps too. But Masa, first from you, what implications does this have? I mean, does it really make a difference, or what can you tell us?
I think it does, and I think we need to incorporate like those viewpoints and the views from the global south, and I think because basically a lot of damages will happen in global south, and the reason we talk about things like CDR and SRM is climate risk reduction. So what does it do to the people who are, these technologies are intended to help? We need to know that. And I think I forgot whether we covered this in the IPCC report itself, but the National Academy of the United States, basically they made a recommendation about sort of, research, including the viewpoint from Global South. And I think we need to have a more collaborative research. If research is perceived to be okay, I don't know whether it's okay or not, but if we have to do the research, we need to do the research itself in a very inclusive manner.
Okay, thanks. Joyashree or Glen? Joyashree, go ahead. If you'd like to come back.
So basically, I would say that it is important how we have global cooperation in knowledge sharing and technology development, because also we need to keep in mind we are talking about very urgent immediate actions, right? So if we have to take immediate action, it cannot be the old model of technology transfer that you deploy, you learn in one country, and then it goes to other countries, so that a very 30, 40 years of learning that happens globally. That is not possible. If you look into energy efficiency, it has taken 30 to 40 years to become a global phenomenon, but that's something which we cannot afford, right? So now any technology development to address the climate change need to happen with international cooperation. And this is something which has come up in IPCC report, chapter 15, where we talk about the international cooperation a lot. And so without international cooperation, I don't think any acceleration in mitigation or removal or radiation management, if need arises, this thing can happen. So this is extremely important, how the global cooperation can build into the whole process, so that from the very beginning, there are inclusive research which happens, and so that the benefit also goes to everybody at the same time without any time lag.
Thank you for that important point, Joyashree. Glen, did you want to weigh in on that at all? Or?
Yeah, I'll just come in with a slightly different, or a scenario angle, I should say, and thinking about where most of these scenarios come from and who's developing these scenarios, that I was showing in my presentation. And the IPCC report is based on a synthesis of about 1,700 scenarios that were submitted to the database, but those scenarios come from different types of models. And the models submitting the most scenarios, so just having a quick look here, out of the top 10 models that were responsible for about 60% of the scenarios, all but one are from Europe or the US, and I think I'd have to check, I think all but two are from Europe. So you could argue that we're looking at a European perspective of the mitigation challenge, which is based around these scenarios. And these scenarios are generally globally cost-effective scenarios, which means, in short, that they don't include equity. So if the cheapest mitigation is in India, the mitigation happens in India regardless of historical responsibilities or per capita or whatever. So these two perspectives, I think, are quite important to putting the context in on carbon dioxide removal, that it's very much coming from a European US perspective and not including equity. That's not to say that if other researchers from other regions had the capacity to do a lot more scenarios, whether they'll necessarily be any different or whatever, but I'm sure we would start to see a range of different perspectives, capturing, from what Joyashree was talking about with the demand side, different aspects of the problem, different ways of thinking about the problem, etc. And we might find, new solutions to the problems that we're not looking at because we're just blinded by our own perspective. So we need a lot more diversity in this field, I think.
Thanks, Glen. And on that note, I think we should finish. I'd like to, we've just gone over slightly, but just remains to say thanks to our three speakers for today for sharing your thoughts and helping us to understand the IPCC's Working Group 3 report in a little more detail. For those that want to find out more, obviously the IPCC website has everything you need in full detail, but on C2G's website also there's resources to help understand a little more detail, and you can scroll down from the homepage and click on the IPCC button there. And thanks for joining us, and join us next time for C2GLearn.